So we talked about human behavioral ecology. Right around the same time, a different movement started taking shape. It is called Sociobiology, after a book that Edward Wilson wrote towards the end of the 70s, and it created a huge controversy in the late 70s and 80s. Here are a couple of individuals, and we will in due course come back to some of the core contributions that these individuals made over time. But why were they so controversial? Because they studied initially animal behavior, but then started to focus their attention again to humans. And they put genes at the forefront of understanding human behavior. So here you see the very strong influence from the genotype onto the phenotype, which put environmental influences for the understanding of human behavior on into the second line of explanation. This is probably not better understood than by just looking at this book by Richard Dawkins, written in 1976, called The Selfish Gene, in which he famously argued, we are survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes. This is the truth which still fills me with astonishment. And we will come back to Dawkins on a number of occasions in this course. Dawkins actually refused to be associated with the sociobiology movement, yet the central point of this movement, which is what is called a gene-centered view or gene-centered explanation of behavior, was very important for his work as well. So let's have a look at some of these individuals and the kind of important contributions that they started to make. The first one we probably need to mention here is uh, William Hamilton, or Bill Hamilton. He was born in Cairo, Egypt in 1936. His parents actually were Kiwis, but then with World War II breaking out, his parents moved to the UK, and that's where he lived for significant parts of his life. And he was interested in studying evolution and genetics. He wanted to study with Ronald Fisher, the person that had helped to start the modern synthesis, but he had just retired. But he was intrigued by the idea that genes potentially could influence or help us understand behavior. And he came up with some pretty insightful ideas very early on, but he had real trouble trying to publish them. So, when he finally managed to publish his thoughts on specifically cooperation and altruism, which is one of those big puzzles from a selfish gene perspective, if you really think about it. Why should we cooperate if, in our best interest, we should actually just take care of ourselves? That's a kind of a, if you think about it, an implication from a gene-centered, a selfish gene perspective. Why cooperate if our best interest is actually to just preserve ourselves? And he developed the idea, or the concept of kin selection, the theory of kin selection, in which through a gene perspective he managed to resolve a few puzzles around cooperation. The basic idea is actually pretty simple. The key to understand cooperation in animals, he argued, is actually genetic relatedness. People will behave altruistically if the cost that is involved for the individual providing help, so the potential risk of dying and not passing on genes, is balanced or offset by the relative chances of copies of my genes to survive if I help those that are genetically related to me. So it's really a ratio between the risk of me dying versus me helping somebody else who's genetically related to me to survive and pass on my copies of genes in that person. So it's related to the degree to which the person that I'm helping is genetically related to me, the costs that I incur for helping, and the benefits that the other person that I'm helping will gain in order to survive and potentially reproduce. So it's a ratio, and we will later in this course we will talk about this ratio and the kind of implications that this ratio had for our understanding of behavior in more detail. But this is really to give you an idea. It was an idea, a theoretical idea, after observing animal behavior and linking it to mathematical notions of genetic relatedness and costs and benefits that would really dramatically change how biologists would look at behavior. Another person that also followed the same kind of type of thinking is Robert Trivers. And he is one of those individuals that is extremely charismatic, controversial. He has been described as an absolute brilliant mind. At the same time, he's reckless, aggressive. He spent 10 days in a prison for a fist fight in a bar. At the same time, he was also named by uh, Times as one of the 100 greatest minds of the 20th century. He suffered from multiple mental breakdowns. He actually enrolled in biology without actually having taken any biology papers, and then within like a few years, while still being in grad school, he revolutionized how biology is working by publishing a couple of theoretical papers. He would later move to Jamaica, disappear from academia, and like after many years would come back to the US and re-engage with academia. And also one of the interesting things is there's often an argument that evolutionary psychology is anti political struggle. Trivers, he became friends with the Black Panther leader Hugh Newton, who was in prison at that time, and started teaching him, and they became friends, and he became actually a member of for a short period of the Black Panthers, so a revolutionary movement in the US that was focused on bettering the lives of African Americans. So just to show, like that the history of evolutionary thinking is often complex and sometimes may not seem as simple as it looks at a first glance. So what did Trivers actually do? Trivers took the idea of a selfish gene and in a very quick succession of papers, he took these ideas and turned around a lot of standard assumptions in biology at that time to solve all sorts of puzzles around cooperation and selection mechanisms, etc., etc. He often was, or he primarily is a theoretical biologist. Edward Wilson famously once said, like the Trivers, like who was also working at Harvard for some time, would sometimes drop into his office and then just start rambling on about all sorts of ideas. And Wilson would say, like this one or these 1 or 2 hours with Trivers were so exhausting because it was such intellectual roller coaster ride that he would be tired for the rest of the day. So he often, like had wild, crazy ideas. Some of them were really important and would shape the field of biology. Others were just weird, right? So he is an eccentric mind. Let's put it this way. And it was this paper here that he published while still a grad student that would again focusing on cooperation and altruism would change, similar to Hamilton's work, how biologists would look at this puzzle that Darwin had talked about. But now let's focus on one of the key individuals within the sociobiology movement. It was Edward Wilson who really put that movement into the hotspot and created lots of controversies. He was an entomologist. He specifically studied ants. So he had a fishing accident when he was a kid, which damaged his eyesight. So a fish hook got stuck in his eye, as it does, right? And so he decided the only way he can now do something is if he studies something up close, and like that motivated him to look at insects, specifically ants, because ants were really this kind of neglected, like class of species. But at the same time, ants are really fascinating because they're highly social. And so he made a lot of contributions to the study of ants, doing field work in Latin America and around the Pacific. And he was also very influential because he started the biodiversity movement. He famously created this idea of biophilia, that humans need to have a connection with other species in nature, etc., etc. But really, what put him onto the major agenda and into the spotlight was the book called Sociobiology in 1975, where he synthesized all the sociobiology work. So he was one of the first people to really understand what Bill Hamilton was on about with his Hamilton ratio, and then he was a mentor to Trivers. So he brought us all together in a book that he published in 1975, and it would have been all good if he had just stuck to animal behavior. But in the last part of the book, he then started applying everything that he had described previously in relation to animals to humans. And this is really what really infuriated people. On one hand, he called for abandoning social sciences, including psychology, and remolding everything under the banner of sociobiology. So as you can imagine, that did not go down very well with with anyone who is not a biologist. And on the other hand, he also said that genes keep culture on a leash. Essentially, culture doesn't really matter if you want to understand human behavior. And this really infuriated people. How come you put culture down in this way? How come you put genetics above anything else in order to understand human behavior? And it's maybe just to give you an idea of his kind of thinking. Here's a little excerpt from his autobiography, in which he defends the ideas from the sociobiology book. There he says, genetic determinism, the central objection raised against Book 2, the chapter on humans, is the bugbear of the social sciences. So what I said can be indeed called genetic determinism. Needs saying here again. My argument ran essentially as follows. Human being inherit a propensity to acquire behavior and social structure, a propensity that is shaped by enough people to be called human nature. The defining traits include division of labor between the sexes, bonding between parents and children, heightened altruism towards closest kin, so that's Hamilton's idea, incest avoidance, that's something that is related to Trivers' work, other forms of ethical behavior, suspicion of strangers, tribalism, dominance orders within groups, male dominance overall, and territorial aggression over limiting resources. Although people have free will and the choice to turn in many directions, the channels of their psychological development are nevertheless, however much we might wish otherwise, cut more deeply by genes in certain directions and in others. So while cultures vary greatly, they inevitably converge towards these traits. The Manhattanite and the New Guinea Highlander have been separated by 50,000 years of history, but still understand each other, for the elementary reason that their common humanity is preserved in the genes they share from their common ancestry. The important point is that heredity interacts with the environment to create a gravitational pull towards a fixed mean. It gathers people in all societies into the narrow statistical circle that we define as human nature. So as you can see, um, genes in his argument keep culture on a leash. And Wilson himself was not really sensitive to, or not really aware of how people might misunderstand some of the things that he was proposing. He was looking at a big picture view. He wanted to, open doors and open ways of thinking rather than really getting boiled down in nitty-gritty detail. But as you can imagine, in the 1970s, the Vietnam War, discussions around race and intelligence testing, there was a lot of argument against reductionism in scientific research. There was an absolute uproar. And one thing that he specifically did not anticipate is how a lot of his biology friends would react against his argument. So I already mentioned Stephen Jay Gould, the adaptationist critique that I mentioned in the human behavioral ecology section was actually equally directed against or probably even more directed against the sociobiologists. Like, how can you actually understand adaptations? And Stephen Jay Gould again wrote a very famous article, critique, called Sociobiology, the Art of Storytelling, in which he again criticized sociobiology for creating what he called just so stories. So referring back to Kipling's book How the Leopard Got His Spots. So the point really is that some of these stories or arguments could be true, but the problem is that Wilson and other proponents of sociobiology, they did not have the relevant data to rule out alternative explanations. So in this sense, it is just convenient just so stories that seem plausible but are not confirmed by data. And this is, again, one of those major challenges that we face if we want to look at long-term evolutionary processes. What kind of evidence can we obtain that moves us beyond the so-called just so stories challenge? How can we design experiments that rule out alternative explanations to prove the point that something really is an adaptation and was designed by some mechanism for that specific purpose, right? So Stephen Jay Gould, in response to the sociobiology movement, rightly pointed out major criticism, and this is one of the criticisms that will apply to a number of the other approaches that we will talk about in this section. Wilson, to his credit, actually took these criticisms on board, and he later noted, again from his autobiography, he wrote, "Without a trace of irony, I can say I have been blessed with brilliant enemies. They made me suffer. After all, they were enemies. But I owe them a great debt, because they redoubled my energies and drove me in new directions. We need such people in our creative lives. As John Stuart Mill once put it, both teachers and learners fall asleep at their posts when there is no enemy in the field." And so he realized, yeah, I got a problem. I can't just willy-nilly apply insights from animal biology to human behavior. And he started reading up as much as he could on psychology, sociology, economics, and other areas. And he teamed up with a theoretical physicist called Charles Lumsden. And together, a few years later, they took these ideas on board and they tried to put together a framework that would allow the joint study of genes, mind, and culture at the same time, what is called a co-evolutionary process in their book. Yet, there were two major problems. The first one is Wilson had spilled all the goodwill in the social sciences and by people who might have listened to him if he had not written sociobiology. So he was a very controversial figure. He had been attacked before giving speeches, physically attacked before giving a speech, and nobody wanted to listen to him anymore within a more kind of humanities, social science perspective. So that was one point. The other point was by teaming up with Lumsden, a theoretical physicist, he took the right path. He tried to bring rigor and a very careful thinking of how genes and culture might be related. At the same time, though, is nobody could follow the equations that they proposed. So what typically happened is Wilson asked the questions and stated the problems, and then Lumsden would develop algorithms that could solve those problems and provide insights. So to their credit, they provided really useful insights into how genes and minds work together. At the same time, nobody wanted to listen to them, and even if they wanted to, they wouldn't typically be able to follow. Because just look at these equations. Who in their right mind, who is not a theoretical physicist, would be able to carefully follow their arguments and be able to see the value of it. And of course, it was the 80s. There were no strong, there was no, there were no strong computers around. So how would you actually model all these kind of things without having one of these huge mainframes around that could model these things? So it was a dead end. People just ignored it, and the serious study of genes, minds, and culture altogether disappeared again for a couple of decades. So the important thing, though, is sociobiology brought the study of evolution back into the main arena of social thought. And probably the biggest impact that this whole debate, this whole movement had was bringing the idea of genes back. So the idea that genes keep culture on a leash. And it's actually one of those interesting questions. To what extent do you think would this argument actually hold water? Is this an argument that makes sense?